how do we as Jews, what calculation goes into picking why we go like with this derech and not that derech, if they're both true? What goes into that?
Now, are you referring specifically to that example, or are you asking more general questions?
Just in general, when there's machlokas tanam or...
Yeah, so you're 100% correct. There is a fundamental principle which is hard to understand, and that is Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Beis Hillel says mutter, Beis Shammai says aser, Beis Hillel says tahor, Beis Shammai says tameh. Which is right? And the answer is they're both right. Both of them are the words of God. If you follow Beis Shammai, you're okay. You follow Beis Hillel, you're okay. So let me just backtrack a little bit. So the obvious question basically is, well, gee, if you believe that both the written Torah and the oral Torah were communicated by God, so any area of machlokes, God gave a psak, God said, what is the halacha? So how can they both be right? God either said kosher, or God said treif, God said tameh, God said tor. How is it shayach to say elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim? So the Ran is masber, the Drashas Haran is masber, that this is a misunderstanding in Torah Shabbal Peh. We make a very big mistake when we think that Hashem gave Moshe a concrete decision on every little decision. For example, did God tell Moshe about electricity, about microwave ovens on Shabbos, about surrogate mother, and about atomic energy? Well, again, maybe Moshe got the message privately, but he certainly didn't tell Bnei Yisroel this, and it was given down. I mean, I've heard people say, for example, again, I always talk about this, so forgive me, I'm sure you've already heard it 5 or 6 times from me, but people say every word of the Gemara was given by Moshe B'Sinai. Well, what does that mean? The Gemara says Abaye and is talking to Rava. What? So Abaye is reading from a script. Abaye was told, we have a Masorah from Moshe that Abaye, you're supposed to say these words, and Rava, you're supposed to... Obviously that makes no sense. Abaye and Rava are talking to each other. So what does it mean when we say, this is based on the Ran, that the Talmud, the Gemara, the Mishnah was given to Moshe B'Sinai? It can't mean as a word-for-word document, because this is about people talking about things and debating things and asking questions. The same thing you're doing in the Beis Medrash, on infinitely lower level. You're doing what Abaye and Rava did. That's it. It's the same basic thing. So the Ran says, when we say that the Torah was given by God to Moshe, the oral Torah, that means all of the principles through which halacha is derivable. The 13 principles of interpretation, whatever it would be. And then it was left to the chachamim of each generation to take those principles and apply them to new reality. The Torah never changes, but reality changes all the time. So we have to find a way. So therefore, when we say there's a machlokas, they're both right, we mean the following. We don't mean that God gave both answers, but God gave principles, and both of these people are chachamim who are following the process. They're following the rules. They're utilizing methodologies. So God may have his own objective private answer to things, but God basically says, I'm leaving it to you guys to figure it out. And as long as you follow the rules, it's like lahavdil. In a math problem sometimes, you're doing a very, this is graduate work, not that I know anything about it, but you're doing very, very advanced graduate level math. And one of those equations that take 5 pages. And your answer is wrong at the end because you added 1 and 3, you made a mistake like that. But a professor will often give you full credit for correct process. So the Ran says, if you follow the methodology of Torah Shabbal Peh, God will consider it to be emes, even if objectively it's not. The Ran differentiates between what he calls mathematical truth and what he calls halachic truth. Mathematical truth, at least in theory, although there are other forms of mathematics, but basic mathematical truth is very fixed and it cannot admit of 2 decisions. 1 + 1 is 2. If you say 3, it's not a matter of opinion. It's simply you're wrong. In halacha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows any number of conclusions to be drawn from common foundational principles. Okay, that's the meaning of Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim. So, when we ask, let's say we have a new shaila, right? 150 years ago, we had a new shaila, are you allowed to turn on an electric light on Shabbos? In those days, it was an incandescent bulb. So when a posek is asked a shaila, so the posek looks at rayas, looks at proofs, analogies. Is the posek really asking, what did God tell Moshe about electric lights? So the Ran says no. God said nothing to Moshe about electric lights. But God gave definitions of fire that we can derive, and therefore we have to apply it. Okay, it's a very important idea. So the Gemara, and again, I hope this doesn't sound irreverent because it's not intended to be. The Gemara is absolutely a man-made document. It's a man-made record of discussions and debates of human beings who are phenomenally great, human beings, who were working off foundational divine principles that were handed out to the generation, but the specific applications are their logic, their reasoning, and therefore, even if the Torah Shebal Peh is not the word of God, the Torah Shebal Peh is the will of God. See the difference? It's not that God gave the words, but it's God's will that halacha be determined by the chachamim applying the divine principles. So it is God's will, but it's God's will that human beings be the conveyors of that truth. And there are deep reasons for that. Maybe we'll talk more about it when it comes to Shavuos. So the question, I have to answer the question. So the question that was raised is, if indeed, as far as God is concerned, both views are equally legitimate because they are rooted in principles, but we have to make a choice. So what are the factors, as it were, that indicate one thing over another? So in the history of halacha, there would be two different types of factors. One type of factor is simply svara. Svara is logic. Again, it's not for us necessarily, but when the great rishonim have to determine which of these opinions should be followed, they have to use what is more logical to them based on their knowledge of everything else in the Torah. Now, logic, as you understand, can mean different things to different people. I might consider a svara, in fact, the power of a svara, every svara has a valence, has a certain power range. I'm sure you've experienced this with your chavrusas. Sometimes a person might say something that is so compelling to them. This is 100% the way it has to be. We'll call that a svara with a powerful valence. And yet, the other guy hears the same svara. Maybe they don't even understand it. Or if they understand it, they say, okay, I'll give it a positive 0.1 charge instead of a positive, 85, charge. But svaras are very important in being machriya. But there's an interesting comment about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel that's very worthy of note. The Gemara itself says, if Elu v'Elu divrei Elokim chayim, why is it that the halacha is like Beis Hillel? What's right? Beis Shammai is equally valid. So the Gemara's answer is, because Beis Hillel were more humble than Beis Shammai, and they always made the point of quoting Beis Shammai before they quoted themselves. That's why in the Mishnah, Beis Shammai is always mentioned first. Now this is extraordinary. In other words, Beis Hillel were greater in middos. Beis Hillel were greater in humility. But is that a reason to pasken like that? Because they were, we pasken like them because they're nicer guys. So you see quite an amazing thing, that middos tovos can sometimes be a factor in determining which halachic position that you're going to adopt. And that's actually a tremendous, tremendous chiddush. I wouldn't say that contemporarily, we use that as a psak, but that was one of the steps that Chazal used. So it is a complicated issue, but I would say by and large, in the historical context, it probably was the valence of svara that was b'machriya, and each neshama kind of is correlating to svara in a different way as to, is this compelling to me, is this less compelling to me? And God calibrated the neshamas of chachamim differently, that they would see things in different ways. Yeah.
If we find ourselves in a circumstance, stuck without a siddur, it's time for Shemona Esrei to bench, to do Birchas Shema, Birchas HaShachar. What should we do? Should we attempt to say a bracha with a wrong or incomplete nusach, or just not attempt the bracha at all?
Yeah, so the question is, again, people always ask you to repeat. The question is, if you don't have a siddur and you don't know it by heart, but you can approximate it to some degree. So you basically say, well, I can't say it right, so therefore I shouldn't say it at all. Would be a bracha levatala, or should I try to say it in my own words, which I may or may not get it right. Now, obviously, if you could literally do a translation of it that you know, although that's not likely, then for sure that's okay. But I'm assuming you're asking that you're not even going to do a translation, but you'll pick up the general idea. That is a very, very excellent question. Lamaisa, it does appear that at least b'diavad, not l'chatchila, as long as you get the tochen is the content of the bracha, and you're able to do the chasima of the bracha even in translation. So you will say, blessed art you, God, the creator of lights, etc. So what I'm saying is you can't improvise on the chasima, but if you can do the tochen of the bracha in any language and do a translation of the chasima, that b'diavad would be a valid form of tefillah, and therefore you should try to do it that way. Now let me point out, when it comes to Shmona Esrei, there is an especially powerful argument that you should do it that way. Let me just mention a very famous machlokas about tefillah. Not about krias, but about tefillah. The shita of the Rambam is that davening to Hashem every day is a mitzvah d'oraisa. There's a chiyuv d'oraisa to daven to God, and that's based on a sifri that darshans on the pasuk, ule'avdei b'chol levavchem, you shall serve God with all of your heart. What is called avodah of the heart? Tefillah. But the Rambam says the following: the nusach of tefillah, Shmona Esrei, is midrabanan, and doing it 3 times is midrabanan. But the oraisa, you gotta do it once in your own words. So now that's the Rambam's opinion. According to Ramban, however, Ramban basically says that there is no chiyuv d'oraisa to daven. There's a chiyuv d'oraisa to say krias shema twice a day. And there's a chiyuv d'oraisa that when you're in trouble, you should daven to God. But to simply create a chiyuv of davening every day, the Ramban says is legamri midrabanan. And therefore, you don't have, in other words, like the Rambam, you have a 2-tier davening system. You have d'oraisa tefillah, which is of any length in your own words once a day. And then you have a rabbinic tier of Shmona Esrei 2 or 3 times a day, depending on whether Ma'ariv is a chiyuv. 2 tiers, a d'oraisa tier and a drabanan tier. According to Ramban, however, there is no d'oraisa tier. All you have is drabanans, which means you either do Shmona Esrei or it doesn't count for anything. So here's the thing. If you don't have a siddur and you don't know Shmona Esrei, at a minimum, you should pray in your own words to God, because according to the Rambam, that would be the fulfillment of a mitzvah d'oraisa. Your question would only be if you followed the Ramban that says Shmona Esrei is the only way I can be Yosei Tefillah. So what do I do if I don't know Shmona Esrei? So then I gave you the idea of the tochen of the brachos and the chasima. But even if you couldn't do that, and therefore, at least according to Ramban, you wouldn't be Yosei Tefillah, like the Rambam, you should still daven in your own words because of the mitzvah d'oraisa. You see? And since we don't really have a hachra, if the halachas like the Rambam or the Ramban, you certainly must be choshesh to the shitas harambam. Does it make sense? That's what I'm saying. So even if you're going to say, God, give me a good day, you should try to say that. Because according to the Rambam, that is a fulfillment of the mitzvah d'oraisa of praying to God, even though it's not at all an adaptation or a translation of Shmona Esrei. They say the Brisker Rav throughout the day, the Brisker Rav would always mumble to himself or mutter to himself, the Eibishter soll helfen, may God help, may God help. So people think he was so nervous that bad things were going to happen that's why he was always asking Hashem for help. He says, no. He was always choshesh, because even like the Ramban, when you're in a nesara, when you're in a difficult time, you got to daven. So it's not that he felt he was having difficulties. He was anxious that maybe he's having difficulties. So al safek deraisa l'chumra, he felt he had to daven. What was unnerving him was not the tzara. What was unnerving him was the shaila, whether he is in an nesara. And that's why he kept on saying, God should help me, God should help me, God should help me, in order to be yotzei tefillah v'chulei alma. No, apparently not, because the chi of tefillah d'oraisa is only once a day. So memela, this would only work, God help me. But the Brisker Rebbe was adding that the Ramban's point that if it's a Sarah, it's d'oraisa. That could be 100 times a day. Mm-hmm. Every time you were in a Sarah, I should daven to Hashem in my own words. So that's what the Brisker Rebbe, why he was doing it. The Rambam's chiyuv of tefillah would only be once a day. Yeah.
If a man has feelings towards other men, a Jewish man, does he avoid things such as davening a minyan, having a chavrusa with another man, or doing Jewish things which might arouse certain feelings?
Yeah, this is a very excellent question. Obviously, we know that halacha is very concerned with male-female interactions because of sexual arousal that could result in emission of sperm or even improper sexual relations. That's the basis of yichud, why I'm not allowed to be alone with women. That's the basis of chibuk v'nishuk, hugging, kissing, holding hands. All of it is because of sexual arousal. And what's the problem with sexual arousal? It's twofold, actually. One problem is emission, well, threefold. In other words, what's wrong with sexual arousal, right? What's wrong with it? So there are really three problems. Problem number one is the emission of sperm outside of intercourse, which is like, masturbation, that's forbidden. Number two is, God forbid, you may cross a border and actually engage in forbidden activity with a woman. And number three, there's a separate inyan of not having your thoughts consumed with sexual fantasies, meaning even if it doesn't lead to anything else, there's an etzem dika problem with the hirhurim that we don't want a person to be preoccupied. Now, the question that you're asking is a very excellent question, and it involves the phenomenon of same-sex attraction. So let's assume a person is a man who is not sexually attracted to a woman, but he's sexually attracted to a man. So as a result, being alone with a man, shaking a man's hand, davening next to a man, on him would have the same effect as a man doing a heterosexual doing this next to a woman. So what are we going to say? Are we going to say, for example, that a gay person cannot have yichud with another man? Are we going to say that he can't shake his hands, he can't hug him, and the like? What about going to shul? So it is an excellent question. I would say this: l'maisa lahalacha. It really, really depends. Meaning to say, this would depend on the subjectivity of it. By that I mean the following: with respect to man-woman, the halacha is very specific and very particularistic. Meaning, even if I'm not aroused by hugging this girl, I'm not allowed to do it because that's called an arousing event. We're not going to differentiate between people who get aroused and people who don't get aroused. But with respect to same-sex attraction, it depends on the situation. If lamaisa there is arousal, then you have to avoid it. If lamaisa there's not arousal, you are allowed to permit it. Meaning the subjectivity of your response will be very relevant in a same-sex attraction. It will not be relevant in a heterosexual attraction. Now, you may ask me the opposite question. Okay, if a person is gay, can he hug a girl? Can he hug a woman? The answer is no, because once again, at a minimum, there's a maris ayin. I mean, you see a man hugging a woman, right? So that's going to be usher as well. Okay, so I would say it very much depends on the person, about chavrusas and everything else, but the question of tefillah b'tzibur is a little more difficult. Is a gay person who wants to be frum, and by the way, there are gay people who really want to keep mitzvos, and they come in different varieties. Some have same-sex attraction, and they don't violate the halacha. That's a very heroic, difficult situation. There are people who literally have same-sex attraction and they don't cross any boundaries. They are tzaddikim mamish. Other people may sometimes be nichshal, but they want to keep as many mitzvahs as they can. That too is worthy of encouragement. So either way, are we going to tell a person with an SSA, whether he acts on it sometimes or doesn't act on it, don't go to shul because you're around men too much, and therefore you're going to lose the mitzvah of tefillah b'tzibur? That's a little more difficult. I think in such a situation we would encourage him to go to minyan, distance himself, the same way we might tell a man at the kotel, don't, there are women all over the place, don't focus. I think we would do that. So it's one thing to say, don't shake hands, don't hug, don't be in intimate settings if it affects you. But I think for tefillah b'tzibur, we would try to work out a way of being able to focus on things. Yeah.
In the tefillah, if someone comes
in what? I didn't hear.
In the middle of tefillah,
yeah.
If someone comes to say hello to you, when can you reply and when can't you reply? And when you can't reply, you just ignore him, like in the middle of the Amidah?
Yeah, so the question becomes, if you're davening at various points, and people want to say hello to you, when do you interrupt, do you acknowledge, and the like. So I'm going to keep it very simple. There are complications between the chapters, etc., but basically, as a general rule of thumb, from the time that you finish the bracha of Baruch She'amar till after Tachanun, you should not talk at all. So that includes Psukei de Zimra, that includes Birchas Krias Shema, that includes Shema, that includes the bracha after Shema, that includes Shemona Esrei, and that even includes Tachanun, right? So you shouldn't talk at all. However, most of the time you are allowed to nod, acknowledge, and you're allowed to point. You're davening, your point. And in Shemona Esrei, you shouldn't even do that. Shemona Esrei, you ignore it. Every other point, you can at least, or either raise your voice, different ways you can communicate it. You can point, you can nod, you can raise your voice, say the words of Shema, but you cannot, really cannot respond. Now, sometimes there are heterim between the prakim and the like, but the truth is we're not noyeg those heterim today because etiquette is different. We're a ruder culture anyway, so people don't expect necessarily that they're going to be greeted. By the way, the Gemara has an interesting story about Yashka and interruptions. Yashka, his name was Yoshua. Yeshua is just an abbreviation for Yehoshua. And Yashka was a Talmud of a Tana, and the Gemara in Saita says it's very important not to be too harsh on your Talmidim. It says, Li'aylam, you should always have the minhag of Yamin Mekareves. You draw people near with your right hand, meaning the dominant emotion that you show is drawing people near. And Daicha Bismo, right? You push people away. When you have to give them discipline, do it with your left hand, which is weaker, meaning discipline and rejection sometimes have to be used, but they should be the weaker force, and the kiruv should be the stronger force. Not like a certain Tana who was too harsh. So it mentions that this Tana was once with his Talmud Yashka at an inn, and the word for inn in Aramaic is ushpiza. Now ushpiza has a double meaning. Ushpiza can mean the inn, or ushpiza can be the female innkeeper. So they're sitting, and the Rebbe says, what a beautiful ushpiza. He meant the inn was very pleasant. And Yashka thought he was talking about the woman, and Yashka said, no, I thought her eyes are too close together. I don't think she's so pretty. So the Rebbe was very offended that, number one, Yashka thinks that's what he's talking about. He's talking about it to him. So he excommunicated him. He says he wouldn't talk to him. And it mentions that for 40 days, Yashka went to ask forgiveness. And the Rebbe decided Yashka wasn't ready yet. And then Yashka finally said, after 40 days, this is it. I'm going today. And if I don't get forgiven, that's it. I'm just leaving this whole thing. And the Rebbe also had the same thought on that day. Okay, it's been enough. He's suffered enough. I'm going to forgive him. I'm going to take him back. So Yashka comes and asks forgiveness. But the Rebbe is in the middle of Shema. And the Rebbe doesn't answer. So Yashka says, now why didn't Yashka figure this out? It's interesting. He probably didn't want to figure it out. Yashka says, that's it! And he goes down to Egypt and he learns magic and sorcery and demons and all the other stuff by which he was able to do whatever he did. So we acknowledge he might have done miracles through sorcery and the like. And the Gemara uses it not as a criticism of Yashka. The Gemara uses it as a criticism of the Rebbe who was too harsh, right? So there is a cost in sometimes not answering. But as I say, for most of us, we could nod and that would be enough, I think. Yeah.
Is shaking the hand okay? And during krias Torah, is it okay? Or is that...
To shake a hand?
Yeah.
So not in Shmoneh Esrei, but other than Shmoneh Esrei, it is mutter, but it's better to really minimize that. Meaning, if you can do a quick, limp shake of a hand without getting distracted, that's one thing. But often, you look at each other, you exchange meaningful glances, whatever it is, and at that point, you're getting distracted from what you're doing. So it's a better practice not to get too involved in that.
And during krias Torah, you can't speak, right?
That's correct. You do not talk to Birchas HaTorah. Now, it is mutter to speak between the aliyos, but lechatchila only in divrei Torah. But it is mutter to speak if necessary. But you try not to. Now, it's interesting that Sephardim are very, very makbid in this. Sephardim are better than Ashkenazim in this particular practice. Even Sephardim we're not from. It's an amazing thing. A Sephardi might not even keep Shabbos at home. But in the Beit Knesset, there's a certain etiquette, there's a certain derech eretz, there's a certain etiquette that you don't talk in shul, and they will not say a word in shul, except if it's relevant to the tefillah and the like. And Ashkenazim, unfortunately, over the years, we've gotten into bad habits. Of course, Baruch Hashem, yeshivas are a lot better than regular shuls, but regular shuls, sometimes the talking can be mamash atrocious. I remember I went into a shul once in the States, and they asked me when I walked into the shul, are you a talker or a non-talker? So I said, well, I try to be a non-talker. She said, okay, we reserve the upper right-hand quadrant for non-talkers. So they have one or two rows of people who don't talk. The rest of the show, the talking was mitchila v'yad sof, Shmoneh Esrei, whatever it was. There was no time when people were not talking. So you couldn't even, it was a small room, you couldn't even hear the chazan. So it's a shreklicha thing. Now, the Mishnah Berurah brings a very scary thing. The Mishnah Berurah talks about, and by the way, let me point out, there are two dimensions here. There is the halachas of not talking during davening. That's a set of halachas. There's another set of halachas of not talking in a beis knesses, meaning you're not even davening at all, but you're in a beis medrash where you learn, or a beis knesses. Then you're not supposed to stop and have conversations. That, bichlal, people don't keep at all. But keep in mind, there's two different things. There's rules about davening and there's rules about shuls. A separate halacha in two different places in the Shulchan Aruch. So the Mishnah Berurah brings from rishonim that there were rishonim who said that during the Crusades, many shuls, many people died and many synagogues got burnt. It was because of the aveira of sichas chullin in a beis haknesses. You didn't treat the beis haknesses with kedusha, so God takes it away from you. Ad kedei kach, it was gairim, the churban of batei knesiyas. So one of the great gedolei Acharonim was the Taisus Yomtiv. You've heard of the Taisus. If you ever look at Mishnayos, you'll see that the Taisus Yomtiv is kind of like a Taisus on Mishnah, right? The Bartanura is like the Rashi on Mishnah, and the Taisus Yomtiv is like the Taisus on Mishnah, going through Pilpul and different things. So the Taisus Yomtiv was the Rav of Prague in the 1500s. He was a Talmud of the Maral. His Rebbe was the Maral. And the Taisus Yomtiv was Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller, was his name. And he composed a special Misha Berach. Misha Berach, we bless people after the Torah reading. A special Misha Berach for people who don't talk during davening. That God should give them life and health and the like. But many rabbis decided not to do it, because when you add an extra Misha Berach, that just increases the talking. That's the paradox. We'll say an extra Misha Berach for people who don't talk. There'll be more talking during the Misha Berach. So they figured maybe they were better off not saying it. But that's a very big union of not talking during davening. And now with cell phones, I mean, sometimes people actually have Now, I'm not dealing with another issue that people raise sometimes. You see more and more that people have their siddur on their, if they have a smartphone, whatever, God forbid no one has a smartphone, but whatever, they have a siddur on their phone. Is it okay to daven from a phone? The truth is, it is okay. I mean, I'm not going to get into the hashkafa that it looks bad. So I'm not talking about davening from a phone. That, you're using your phone for a siddur, that's okay. But I'm talking about people who have conversations on their phones in the middle of davening. Whatever part of davening that is, that's a tremendous chilul Hashem and a tremendous lack of respect to a Beis HaKnesses. This is Hashem's home. I mean, imagine if you had a meeting with the President of the United States or the President of Israel or Prime Minister or something, and in the middle of your meeting, your phone goes off and you say, tell the President, wait a minute, and you just pick up the phone. Yeah, I'll pick up the pizza when I get home. What type of respect is that? So you're lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, and you have conversations, and you pick up your phone. One has to think about this, that when you're davening, you're omed lifnei Hashem. That's how you have to feel. So you try to minimize this to whatever degree you can. Yeah?
Halachas not talking basic nesses outside of the Shas Tefillah,
yeah.
Are they still relevant or not relevant?
So here's the thing. It's brought down, actually. We have two categories. We have base Knesses and base Medrash. Now, a base Knesses is a place that is only used for davening, nothing else. A base HaMedrash is used for Torah learning, but can also be used for davening. So the poskim say that Bisman Hazeh, there is almost no category anymore of a base Knesses, because everything that we call a base Knesses, there will at least be a rabbi's drasha, and even that qualifies as Torah learning. So as a result, the halachas that we look at, Legabe our shuls today, even the young Israels, not just the yeshiva-based medrash, is we look at all of our shuls as batei medrash and not as batei knesses. So the relevant issue is, what is the halacha of sichas chullin in a base medrash? You are correct. And in a base medrash, it is brought down, there's a certain leniency that is permitted. And the reason is because Chazal, for example, allowed you to eat some food in a base medrash, although not a base knesses, because they didn't want people to constantly stop their learning. If I want to drink some water, to leave the room, etc. So because of this, we do permit a certain amount of sichas chullin, but the Mishnah brings down that even in a base medrash, the heter of sichas chullin is not going to allow kalus reish. It's not going to allow levity, fooling around, things like that. So things like, it's really a big problem. We sometimes make Purim plays in a show. It's a real big shaila, like what's the heter of that's going to be. But you are correct. Sichas chullin bebeis knesset is a little more lenient because our batei knesiyos have the din of a beis hamedrash today. Yeah.
I was recently speaking to somebody who was going through a difficult challenging time in his life, and he mentioned to me how he suspects that Hashem was punishing him for maybe potential sins that he's done over the years. And the thought just came to my head, I guess, I know that the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva discusses how the tshuva process for different categories of chataim, and how for certain chataim, if he does tshuva on the spot, he's forgiven right away, and other categories require yisurim or even yom misa. And the question I had was that is it possible for a person to commit a mistake or commit a sin without having any consequences in some way? Meaning, if tshuva is done in the right sense, does that formula always have to happen, or is it possible for a person not to necessarily see the consequences of the sin that he's done?
Yeah, so let me just go over this very, very quickly. The Rambam, at the end of Perek Aleph of Hilchos Tshuva, it's really a brisa at the end of Maseches Yuma. The Rambam says there are 4 types of averos, and each type has a different relationship with tshuva. We'll go from category 1 to category 4, and category 1 will be the lowest sin. So 1 to 4 is going from lower to higher. The lowest sin is simply omission. I failed to do a mitzvah taseh. I didn't read Shema. I didn't put on tefillin. That's an aveira, but since it's not an action, all you need to do is sincere tshuva. God forgives you. There will not be any other consequences once you do tshuva. That's category 1. Category 2 is much more chamor. I transgress a negative commandment. I ate chazer. I spoke lashon hara. There I did a maisa aveira. So there, tshuva is necessary, but you also need the cleansing power of Yom Kippur. You're not in a state of forgiveness till you've afflicted yourself through the Yom Kippur fast days. Okay, category 3, going up, is I do an aveira where the punishment, when there was a beis din, is the death penalty or kores, premature death. So there, you need tshuva, you need Yom Kippur, and you need a certain amount of suffering in the world. Now, the suffering can be major or could be minor. Suffering could be anything. Suffering could be you missed your bus. Suffering could mean you put your hand in your pocket to take out 5 shekels, and you only took out 2 shekels. Or suffering, God forbid, could be serious illness or poverty. How much suffering is God's cheshbon? We don't even know. But there has to be some suffering. There cannot just be tshuva for it. And then category 4 is worst of the worst. And that's an aveira that's so bad that tshuva doesn't help, Yom Kippur doesn't help, suffering doesn't help. You remain with that sin on your back, on your head, your whole life, and only death itself can give you atonement together with everything else, and that's desecration of God's name, Chilul Hashem. Now, if you think about this, Chilul Hashem doesn't even have to be an aveira otherwise. In other words, I was rude in line, I pushed, I did something that people look at me and say, it's very scary. If that's what a Ben Torah does, then that's an ugly thing. Chilul Hashem, the worst of the worst. No kapara till death. Now, the emes is, Rav Steinman would explain that this doesn't mean every Chilul Hashem is that way. Because Chilul Hashem itself has many, many levels. There's a Chilul Hashem that I was a little rude in a line, and there's a Chilul Hashem that, I cheated the government of, 10 billion shekel for a yeshiva. So Rav Steinman meant some Chilul Hashems can be so bad that there's no kapara, but other Chilul Hashems might be like any other aveira. So that's comforting. That's a good thing to know. But the other thing to know is that all of the Svarim tell us that tshuva itself has many, many, many infinite levels. And there is what you might call regular tshuva. I regret what I did and I want to be better. But then there's a tshuva that is so deep and so transformational that you're literally a different person. And those types of tshuvas can even avoid the yisurin, the suffering, and everything else. So the short answer is that the Rambam is stating things as they generally are, but yes, there are types of tshuva that are so deep. They're very rare, by the way, though. They're very rare, but they can uproot everything. They can change everything because you've gone through a whole process in which you are literally a new person from the inside out. Now, the other thing, though, I think it's important to know, you mentioned that this person is feeling that God is punishing him for his sins. There are 2 ways of looking at that. Even if that's true, and we really don't know, but even if that's true, I think there's a constructive way of looking at it, and there's a destructive way of looking at it. The destructive way is, God hates me, he just despises me, he wants to hurt me, he wants me to suffer. That's not emes. Even when God is punishing as the nature of spiritual therapy, to make you better, to make you stronger, to fix you up so you can connect to him in Olam Haba. So it's important, maybe punishment is not even the right word. I think spiritual therapy is a very good word for Gehenna. Gehenna can be described. If you ever had, I hope none of you had this, but you may know people that had this. A person has an accident, a person breaks his legs in a skiing accident. Very, very serious accident. And it takes months and months and months, maybe years, to be able to walk again. And sometimes you walk into a hospital and you'll see a person they're trying to train to walk, and the person will be screaming, the person will be crying, the person will be begging, let me go back to bed. Don't make me do this. The pain is so awful. It really can be. To try to relearn to walk again. It can be excruciating. And what the family does, and I've seen this myself, and the wife is crying, the wife is sobbing that she's putting her husband through this. But she knows she has to, because that's the only way he's going to walk. That is almost a perfect analogy, Lanias Daiti, of what Gehenna is. Hell is hell. No question about it. But it's not a hell to punish. It's not a hell, I hate you and I want you to suffer. It's the spiritual therapy to repair a broken soul, so the soul will be able to go to Olam Haba and connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When the soul is broken, it's not capable. So if he can understand that even if it is a punishment, and we don't know if it is, it's not a punishment out of vengeance, anger, hatred. It's a punishment out of love for a therapeutic goal. That is why, now, gets us into big controversy, and once again, I don't want to get into the perennial Manis Friedman debates that somehow I always get dragged into. But is there a concept in Judaism of eternal damnation? Is there a concept, right? Everyone knows that the famous Chazal, that Gehenna lasts no longer than 12 months. But are there people so bad that Gehenna, hell is forever? Gehenna is forever and ever and ever. To be honest, I mean, is Hitler burning in Gehenna forever and ever and ever? To be honest, there are some Chazals that do talk about eternal damnation. Some Chazals. But, and I'm just trying to be honest with you, if you think about it, the logic of eternal damnation is very, very difficult to understand. Because if the tachlis of Gehenna is to be masakein, a broken soul, so it can be connected to God in Olam Haba, if a soul is so broken that it can't be fixed, it would seem, would it not, that the correct solution would simply be oblivion. Throw it into the garbage. What would God's purpose be with eternally torturing somebody? That would be, again, we shouldn't say it about Hashem, but that would sound like being sadism. So the notion of an eternal Gehenna is very, very difficult to understand, meaning a limited Gehenna can be understood as a spiritual therapy that fixes you so you could be connected to God. Oblivion makes sense because a soul might be so messed up that there's no way you could fix it. I understand that as well. So there's either reincarnation maybe, or there's garbage heap. But the notion that the soul remains alive and is going to be tortured forever and ever, what would God get out of that? Like, what would the tachlis be? This is something to think about. Well, okay. I mean, the problem is that there are some sources that say Gehenna is only 12 months, which makes sense. There are a few sources that talk about eternal Gehenna, which is a bit of a tzorichian exactly. What would God's purpose be in eternal damnation? Yeah.
There was an Acharon before the First World War that said, he wrote a letter that said there's going to be two wars, and then there's going to be two world wars, and then there's going to be the war of emunah. I forgot the name of the Acharon, but I wanted to know if everybody thinks that right now, what's happening in the world, if this is the war of emunah.
Yeah, the actual statement, there are going to be two world wars. Again, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the Chafetz Chaim said many things like that. I don't remember the exact wording, but he did say after World War I that this is child's play compared to what's coming down the pike. So he did foresee that there would be a second world war and a massive holocaust and destruction of the Jewish people. The war of emunah, though, makes a lot of sense because we have these two world wars. Now, Baruch Hashem, right now we don't have a world war, but although you don't know what can become. But a war of emunah we certainly have, because we live in a world in which all of the values of the Torah are under attack. All of the values. Not just bein adam lamakom, but bein adam lechavero, gender identity, sexual identity, abortion, all of these different issues. And we also live in a world where hatred against Jews is growing every single place, not only in Eretz Yisrael. Now, people always say, oh, Eretz Yisrael, so dangerous, how can you live in Eretz Yisrael? Well, what on earth is going on in America? Columbia University, which it was predominantly a Jewish campus, I don't know, for years and years, maybe it still is. Jewish students were told they had to hide in some room in the library because the mobs were coming to get them, and all of those things that are going on. So in many, many ways, there are two ways Hashem gets the Jews to Eretz Yisrael. One is we get pulled by Kedusha. We get pulled here. That's the good way. The other way is we get pushed out of the gullus. In other words, if I don't see the good of coming here, I get pushed out. So unfortunately, we're operating with a push philosophy. But as I say, as the Jews get more and more hated, as Israel gets more and more reviled, as we get accused of being Nazis, right? There have been many, many people, you go to mainstream media, people are comparing the state of Israel to Nazi Germany and the like, and what's going on in Gaza to Holocaust, not just apartheid, that's one thing. Now it's Holocaust level and the like. So yeah, our emunah is being challenged quite a lot. And Hashem is waiting to see who holds out, who has the commitment to stay with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even when times are very, very difficult. There's no question that the Mishnah in Saita, and everyone should look at this Mishnah. The last Mishnah in Saita talks about all the different signs of ikvasa de Mashiach, in the footsteps of Mashiach. And you can just go through the list and you see so many things that are happening today are the footsteps of Mashiach. So but again, I'm not sure I can identify precisely your quote, but the Chavetz Chaim said many, many things along those lines. Yeah.
There's a send-in. My 13-year-old daughter asked me, why is it not tzanuah for a girl to play sports or perform or speak in front of a public mixed crowd, while it is not considered problematic for a boy? I have a hard time articulating this up in the Rakud.
Yeah, so this is let me repeat, this was a question from a 13-year-old girl who asked her father, why is it not modest, why is it not tzanuah for a girl to play sports or to give a public speech when her brother, who also was supposed to be modest, can certainly play sports? Although in some Haredi communities that's not allowed either, but let's assume the boys can play sports, and the boy can obviously publicly speak, say a Dvar Torah. What is exactly un-tzanuah about it? So first of all, I do want to commend the young lady for recognizing, as implicit in her question, that obligations of tznius are not only for women, they are for men. Men have obligations of tznius as well. It may not be so focused on dress, but tznius is much more a matter of attitude than it is specifics of behavior. Tznius is behaving with modesty, reticence, not trying to show off, not trying to be ostentatious, kind of a simplicity of life. Men should be tzanuah, women should be tzanuah. Hatznei halachas in Hashem Elokecha comes from Micha. What does God want from you? Avas chesed, shimru mishpat, to observe justice. Avas chesed, love kindness. Vatznei halachas, and to walk with Hashem with modesty. So it is important that tznius applies to men as well. But women have a particular obligation of tznius, simply primarily because of the sexuality in the man-woman relationship. So women do have an obligation not to dress in ways that call attention to their bodies and the like, because once again, I see a man with shorts, unless I have an SSA, I'm not necessarily turned on. A girl may be a different type of situation. So it's not that only women have tznius and not men, but the particulars of tznius may have a unique application to women. Now, that does not yet answer your question. Okay, so I understand, I assume the young lady understands why girls have to dress modestly, covering the knees, covering the elbows, loose-fitting clothing, which, by the way, may even be more important than length, right? Sometimes you see in the modern Orthodox community, maybe even the Haredi community, a very, very unfortunate phenomenon in which everything is the right length, but it's 2 sizes too small. So the body is accentuated in all sorts of ways. That is actually, I don't want to be too explicit about this, but that is actually more provocative than short. So it's not just length, it is also the looseness that doesn't accentuate the anatomy that much. And by the way, men should be the same thing. Again, I don't want to be too explicit, but sometimes pants might be so tight that everything is visible, kind of, and that is absolutely improper. Gedolim have said that men should not dress in ways that accentuate their anatomy either. That is a lack of tznius. But okay, but with all of that said and done, I haven't answered the question yet, and that is, okay, the girl is dressed tzanuah, the girl's clothing is loose enough and everything else. What is wrong with the girl giving a Devar Torah in public at her bas mitzvah to a mixed audience, let's say, to a female audience? There is no problem. And what is wrong with her playing sports? So let me take the bas mitzvah speech first. The truth of the matter is, what can I say? I'm an American rabbi. I was the rabbi of a right-wing modern Orthodox show. So to me, I have to admit, I don't have a visceral reaction like a girl giving a bas mitzvah speech is the worst sin in the world. Indeed, I had it done. If a girl wanted to give a speech in my kehillah, it was okay. So my first answer is, there's nothing particularly wrong with it anyway. But those who are more to the right, more Haredi, do feel that it is a way of a girl drawing attention to herself. And once men are focusing on the girl, then who knows, that could lead to some type of improper thought. So the issue that they would consider is drawing attention. Drawing attention. Again, as I say, I don't have much of a problem with it, but this would be the idea. Girls should not do things that draw attention to them in the eyes of men, because God forbid that could break down some barriers of tznius. The question becomes, how far do you take that? And I'm asking this as an honest question. Can a girl do a piano recital? Is that a lack of tznius, right? If I have an 11th grader in Beis Yaakov and she plays piano, and it's not kolish and nobody's singing, she's just playing the piano. But if she's a soloist, everybody's watching her play the piano, is that going to be a problem? I don't know. Ask the people who are against girls speaking, would they be against a piano recital? I'm just throwing it out as a question. Now, what about sports? So it really depends what the questioner means. If you meant, she wants to play on the boys' basketball team, well, there's obviously a problem there in co-ed sports because, she's with boys, there's be touching and everything else. So that's, I think, very pashut. It's very obvious why a girl cannot play on a sports team with boys, maybe other than her brothers, if they want to do their own hockey league or whatever it is. So that's pashut. So I'm assuming that the question that's being asked, if it's separate girls' sports. Once again, I will plead guilty as being the modern Orthodox, right-wing Orthodox rabbi. I don't have a big problem with girls playing sports in separate women's-only leagues, not in public places with mixed audiences. But if it's mixed audiences, even if it's, mom and dad, parents are watching, you do have a problem, and I think the sports issue is more of a problem than the speech issue. The speech issue, the girl is giving a speech. The sports issue, she's moving around, she's jumping, she's wearing a basketball jersey, basketball jumper, she's not dressed tzanuah, depending. So there are problems. Again, if it's mixed, for sure not. If it's girls only, theoretically it could be mutter, but if it's done with a mixed audience, I think there are going to be tznius problems. I mean, let me just remind you, I don't want to be too graphic, but consider the male athletic coaches of girls' sports programs and the trouble that a number of them got in because of sexual improprieties. In other words, things happen when you don't keep these boundaries and you're just, I'm working with the girls' basketball team. A lot of bad things happen. There are people serving life sentences in jail because they were the male coaches of girls' basketball teams. So the wisdom of the Torah in creating these boundaries, people think, oh, it's so old-fashioned, it's so anachronistic, you're afraid, I'm alone with a woman, I'm going to rape her. What's going on there? Aren't we civilized people? Well, the answer is maybe we're not so civilized people. If you look at employment manuals, let's say you apply to work for IBM or Westinghouse, some big company, and they give you an employee manual. They're going to tell you now things that sound like they're translations from the Shulchan Aruch. He says, if you are working with a woman after 5 p.m., be sure there are other people in the office. Keep the office door open. Men are not supposed to hug women. So where does this come from? IBM, they learned the Shulchan Aruch? Now, it's not that the heads of IBM became Balei Tshuva. That's not what happened. They're afraid of sexual harassment litigation. They're afraid of being sued. It's totally, Me Too movement. It's totally shalom lishma. But what do you see from this? You see from this that even secular society recognizes that there have to be boundaries. There have to be separations in the male-female relationship because, frankly, sexuality can get out of control. You may say, oh, that's so old-fashioned. Well, it's not old-fashioned. It happened, and it happens. And it happens today. So I think that would be the problem with girls, aspects of girls' sports. Yeah.
In Sefer Yehoshua, we find that all the Jews born in the door of the midbar had to be finally circumcised before entering Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah.
And the midrash explanation I've heard is that there wasn't a favorable wind for recovery after a bris. For me, this has always been very difficult to understand how Bnei Yisroel was over on the middos of bris of Korban Pesach, both had kares just because there wasn't a favorable wind. Could Rabbi please help us explain why this?
So this is really referring, once again, in the Sefer Yehoshua. This, in fact, was the Haftarah for the first day of Pesach that we read a few weeks ago. It mentions that one of the first things Yehoshua did after Bnei Yisroel crossed the Yarden River was all of the men had to circumcise. Even though they were adults, they had to do a bris, because it mentions all the Jews who left Mitzrayim, all the men who left Mitzrayim had a bris milah, but all of those who were born in the desert did not have a bris milah. Now, of course, most of the people who were born in the desert, well, they were born in the desert, so obviously they were not they were not nichlal in the Meraglim, so they came to Eretz Yisrael, but all of those people needed a bris before the Korban Pesach. So the Gemara now the pasuk in Yehoshua doesn't give a reason. What would the reason be that the people who were born in the desert did not have a bris? Doesn't give a reason. So the Gemara in Yevamos does give a reason, and it says that when you are traveling in the desert, when you're moving your baby around, and you never know when you're going to have to travel, doing a brit milah was a sakana, would be dangerous. But there's a certain medicinal healing quality of the northern wind that facilitates recovery. And after the Chet HaMeraglim, one of the ways we were excommunicated by God is we didn't have the benefit of that northern wind, and therefore we were exempt from bris milah because it was a sakana. So it was a bona fide exemption. Now, I imagine that as a religious Jewish person, people would feel awful that they're going through the whole desert experience without a bris milah. It's an awful thing. But nevertheless, halachically, it was called pikuach nefesh, and that's what the Gemara says, the reason why there was no bris. Yeah.
Can the Rav give a couple examples of proof that God exists and proof that the Torah is MS?
Yeah, can I give a couple of examples that God exists and that the Torah is true? Well, once again, this is an area I mentioned before, the valence of an explanation, right? People give different explanations, and for some people, it's very, very powerful. Other people, it leaves them a little cold. They don't see the compelling nature of it. For me, let's first talk about the existence of God. Then I'll talk a little bit about Torah. These are two different issues. You understand they are two different issues because I could believe in God as the creator of heaven and earth, but I don't automatically believe that God gave mitzvah. So, in a sense, you can believe in God without the Torah, but you couldn't believe in the Torah without God. In other words, if you say that the Torah is divine, then that presupposes there's a God. So it's asymmetrical in which one proposition can exist without the other, but the other proposition cannot exist without the first one. In terms of evidence of God, I would say is the structure of the universe itself. And the truth of the matter is, the more one delves into science, the more one will be convinced that there was a cosmic intelligence behind everything. This was Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein did not believe in a personal God that gave mitzvahs. That's very unfortunate. But he did believe that there must be an architect to the laws of science. Because the universe is, on one hand, there are billions and trillions of phenomena in the universe, but they can be subsumed under predictable, stable laws. There are only 4 forces that explain billions and trillions of phenomena. There's electromagnetism, there's gravity, there's what's called strong force and weak force. That explains everything. And the major project in physics is to try to see if we could discover one force that explains those other 4. That's called the theory of everything and the like. Now, that means we live in a world where there's coherence, where there's structure, where there's intelligence that's very, very evident and visible. Now, if there was not a creator, if there was not an intelligent designer, why would you expect to find coherence? There would just be randomness. There would just be chaos. There would just be disorder. Who would be the architect of any type of structure if there is no architect? So point number 1 is the coherence and structure of science. Now what's amazing is that this is something that even an atheist is behaving as if they believed in God. I mean, there are many scientists who are atheists. I'm not going to deny that. But every scientist is looking for the underlying laws that explain things. But if you don't believe in God, then why would there be underlying laws? What's your assumption? Why are you assuming you're going to find any type of regularity? Why are you assuming that if I throw up a pen and it goes down, it's automatically going to go down the next time? Why? Law of gravity? Who made the law of gravity? Who made it that it would happen? So I do think that in a deep way, the coherence of science and the notion of scientific law is evidence of a creator. Now, I'll mention another aspect of this, and this is called the anthropomorphic principle. And that is, anthropomorphism just means taking the shape of a human being. There are certain conditions that have to be necessary for life to exist. Life cannot exist unless you have conditions of temperature, certain nutrients in the atmosphere, and the like. And all of these elements exist on planet Earth. Whether they exist on other planets, we don't know. As far as we know, we have not yet discovered another planet in which all of these conditions are met. Now here's the question. What are the probability that all of these conditions are met? Meaning, if the Earth would be a few miles closer to the sun, it would burn up. If the Earth would be a few miles further from the sun, it would become an ice ball, a ball of ice. It has to be exactly where it is. And again, I don't have a whole list here, but there are like hundreds of conditions that have to be met. Stephen Jay Gould, who happened to be Jewish, he's not alive anymore, he was a very eminent professor in Harvard University. He was also a dyed-in-the-wool atheist, unfortunately. So he didn't want to admit there was a God, but he said, it sure seems as if somebody invited us to this party. Something was created so we could be here. It's so unlikely. So coherence coupled with the anthropomorphic principle, I think, are probative indicators of God. The third thing I would call your attention to is the existence of the Jewish people. Now, some people like this, some people don't, but to me, it's very compelling. The Jewish people logically should not be here at all. We don't make sense. We were numerically a small nation. All of the great empires of the ancient world tried to destroy us. In modern times, we had the Crusades and the Holocaust. And even today, Hamas wants to destroy us. Why are we around? And not only are we around, we're not like around in a cave in Afghanistan. We're around in very positive ways. You know, when people say the Jews control the world, I mean, you know, they're not far wrong in terms of the influence that Jews have in the world. It's way out of proportion. If you ask the average person what percentage, let's say, of the U.S. are Jewish, so they'll say, oh, it got to at least be 45%. It's like what, less than 1%? It's a very tiny percentage. So it's so miraculous, it's so illogical that there would be a Jewish people that it's almost as if, I would think we have to say, that God had a mission. Now, we may not keep that mission. I understand. We flub it all the time. Yeah, I got that. But God kept us here because we have a purpose. And I think that's pretty good evidence of God, the evidence of the Jewish people. Another issue that I would bring up is, how do you explain, now this would be more of a controversial proof, how do you explain morality? Most people, unless you're psychopathic, by the way, psychopaths are scary people, because a psychopath is not like a crazy person. A psychopath is a normal person who literally has no conscience. It's the most eeriest thing. You know, some guy is crazy, like Hitler is foaming at the mouth, okay. But a psychopath sits here, you know, talk like anyone else, and they just have no conscience. So I once saw an interview with a psychopath, a woman, and she was saying, you know, people have the wrong idea about me. I don't get up in the morning and I want to dismember 10 people. She says, I only kill if there's a reason for it. She says, I don't randomly, you know, you don't have to be afraid of me when I go into a supermarket. Unless, you know, you're holding up the line, whatever. Okay. But be it as it may, unless you're a psychopath, most of us have conscience. Most of us have a sense of morality. Most of us feel that certain things shouldn't be done. It's wrong to kill. It's wrong to steal. Now, here's the question. If you don't believe in God, why shouldn't I kill? Why shouldn't I steal? What is the essence of morality within the human personality, minus a God that planted it in me? Dostoevsky says in Crime and Punishment, without God, all things are permitted. What's wrong? If I want your sneakers, why shouldn't I kill you? Exactly how a psychopath reasons. I'm not going to kill you, Stam, but I want your sneakers, so I'll kill you. What's the problem? And yet, most people recoil at that. So one could make the argument that the existence of a natural morality within the human personality might be evidence of God. So these are different thoughts. Now again, I'm not suggesting any one of them is irrefutable, but the way these things work is if you have a number of indicators, it builds up the case stronger and stronger. Yeah.
So we still have the point of the Torah. But
yes, I want to address that, yeah.
Just on that last point, is Rabbi saying that if you have a child that grew up in the jungle with monkeys and then he came to human civilization and he murdered someone, he would, like, there would be a part of him that feels bad, like morals exist outside of...
Again, we would have to, you know, try to prove that scientifically. I'm not sure we can, but I think the way Judaism views it is, even if they weren't taught, Hashem implanted within the neshama certain feelings that some things are wrong, and people know that those things are wrong. There's a natural morality within the human personality, which only makes sense if you posit a creator. Now, all of this may be evidence of God, but how do we know that, you know, God gave the Torah, that God said put on tefillin and keep Shabbos and don't wear shabbos? So maybe, you know, God created us and God gave us morality, okay, but maybe God didn't give us those commandments and the like. So that is in some ways a more difficult question. The most famous proof is the argument of Yehuda Halevi, ad kedei kach, that this is called the Kuzari principle, because it is derived from the Kuzari. And Rabbi Gottlieb has come out, made a career about this. Rabbi Gottlieb has written more than one book going over all of the ramifications of this principle. So if you're interested, you can look at it. But basically, this is the idea that mass revelation is a non-falsifiable claim, meaning the following. Most religions were based on private revelation, that God spoke to me, and I convince you that God spoke to me, and I get followers because of my charisma, because of my wisdom, because of my speaking ability. And the claim ultimately is because God spoke to me. That would be true with Jesus, that would be true with Mohammed, and the like. Now, those are falsifiable data, because a guy could make up a story, and if he's convincing enough, he convinces people. Judaism has a bit of a different claim. Judaism claims that God did not just speak to Moshe. God spoke to 3 million people. Now, how do you make up that story? You know, if I say to you, God spoke to me last night, I might be able to convince you that he did. And, you know, maybe you'll believe me. And then the word can spread. But if I go over to you and I say, hey, God spoke to you last night, you're going to say, really? I have no recollection of that. And if I say to everybody in this room, God spoke to all of you last night, well, you know that wasn't the case. So how do you start off with a claim that God spoke to 3 million people unless it actually happened? In other words, this is a lie that you can't get away. This is a lie that you can't get away with, and therefore it got to be true. This is called the Kuzari principle. And many say that this is considered to be proof of the revelation at Sinai. Now I want to say, I have to, again, I try to be honest, sometimes maybe too honest, and that is the Kuzari principle is not a complete proof. At most, the Kuzari principle can prove that God gave us the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai to 3 million people. But here is the problem. There is much more in the Torah besides the 10 Commandments. Now, the rest of the Torah, we did hear from Moshe. Moshe went up to Mount Sinai for 40 days, and then he came down and gave us the Torah. So the mass revelation argument only works for the Aseret HaDibros. The mass revelation argument does not work for the other 603 commandments of the Torah. At that point, if you're cynical, Judaism and Christianity focuses on are standing on the same footing. God told me something, you got to trust me. That's why the Kuzari principle is not all-encompassing. However, the Torah seems to indicate that part of the Sinai revelation to the 3 million was that Moshe Rabbeinu is God's authorized representative. Therefore, even though we got the Torah from Moshe, not from God, but in the mass revelation, God certified Moshe as the authoritative messenger. So that would be the difference. Rabbi Kellerman, many of you might know him or come across his book. He wrote 2 books. One is called Permission to Believe, which are 4 proofs for the existence of God. I'm not sure how much they overlap with what I said. And the other is Permission to Receive, which is on Matan Torah. So he literally wrote 2 relatively short books on the subject. He also has a lot of lectures on YouTube, but these 2 books might be something you can look at for both of those questions. Yeah?
So why was it necessary for the Torah to enumerate so many of the nuances regarding like the cehunah and whatnot, and not like talk more about, especially because nowadays a lot of it isn't so practical, and not talk about middos or stuff that's more practical for later generations? Yeah,
it's a very excellent question as to the amount of space the Torah allocates to different topics. There are many, many fundamental areas of Judaism, fundamental mamash, that the Torah barely addresses, even something like Shabbos. If you collate all of the verses in the Torah about Shabbos, so you'll get maybe 15 verses. If you take all of the verses about leprosy, tzaras, you have around 80 verses. Much more about Saraf than about Shabbos and the like. And then you have details of Korbanos, details of cehunah, and the like. So I don't really have a complete answer for this, other than, at least in your particular question, although it doesn't answer the question in general, is that the Torah understands that Kohanim are were designed to be, although it's not today, but when there's a Beis HaMikdash, they're supposed to be the spiritual leaders of Am Yisrael. And therefore it's necessary to define their roles in very precise and technical terms, because otherwise you have the problem of an abuse of power. Because when I'm put in a position where I am your spiritual leader, there was always a danger that I could abuse that position. And therefore the Torah wants to define the role very specifically, define the qualifications, and that way, to use modern terms, there is transparency. People know exactly what the Kohen can do, what the Kohen cannot do. And in that way, a Kohen abusing his power by taking advantage of people as their spiritual leader is going to be minimized. But that doesn't answer, tzaras and various other things. In fact, I even heard it said, it's more of a modern explanation, but maybe it makes sense, that the reason why a Kohen is not allowed to come in contact with the dead is that when people are in bereavement, they're in a psychologically very weak place. And therefore the Kohen, as the spiritual leader, could take advantage of their vulnerability. Kind of saying, for example, like sometimes the tele-evangelists, your mother would surely want you to give all of your wealth, to the church or to me, whatever it would be. And therefore the Torah says, precisely when people are most vulnerable, the Kohen should not be involved in their lives at that time. Again, that's a more modern explanation. It's not something the yeshivish world, necessarily goes into, but it's an interesting perspective about abuse of power. And I can tell you, the issue of spiritual leaders and abuse of power is a very, very relevant issue today. I don't mean chas v'shalom gedolim. Gedolim are holy, but sometimes you will find heads of schools or various other situations in which they have almost a Svengali-like influence, again, particularly on female students. And this has resulted in a number of tragic scandals. I don't know, again, I'm not sure if you'd bother following it, but once again, that's why charisma, I give so many topics here, charisma is very dangerous, particularly and sometimes in some institutions, the charismatic personality, the one who lights up the room, the one who excites everybody. That's the greatest teacher. And maybe so. But charisma is very dangerous because the nisayon of charisma is it becomes much more about the teacher than about the Torah. It's no longer Hashem. It's no longer mitzvos. It's no longer halacha. It's what is called a personality cult. And the personality cult can be very, very, very poisonous. And we've seen the tragedy of it. It is said, I'm not advocating this, but it is said that the Alter of Slobodka, who gave beautiful, deep Musar talks, cultivated a very boring monotone when he spoke. He did not try to be dramatic. He tried to be deliberately boring. Again, I'm not recommending that as a teaching device. But his cheshbon was, I want people to be moved by my content, not by my style. And charisma works exactly the opposite way, where everything is about style. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to the notion of we got to define the roles of the spiritual advisor and give him a very precise role. Yeah?
On this topic, I've heard a few Litvish Rebbe's criticize chassidus on this concept that it's all through the Rebbe's, you're connected to Hashem, and that's what they fought so heavily against. Could Rebbe please explain?
Yep, you're 100% correct. One of the dangers of chassidus was fostering the personality cult. Again, to some degree, that may have occurred in some aspects of Chabad. On the other hand, that's not the Rebbe himself. The Rebbe himself specifically pushed people in the opposite direction. It's important to know that. The Rebbe Bedavka did not want personality cults, Sometimes the Hasidim loved him so much that they gravitated in that direction. But his message always was, you have to develop. In fact, this goes back to the Alter Rebbe. You have to develop your own connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah.
So we take it as granted that free will is a premise of Judaism, that we need to have free will. What's the point of anything we do really? But this seems to be a point of debate among some of the rishonim, at least like Rabbi and others, who doubt the fact that we have free will, or free will is an illusion or something like that. So how do we, is free will something, what I'm asking was free will something that was always fundamental to Judaism? And if so, how could some of these rishonim break from it?
Well, you do have to understand that our whole view of Jewish theology, for the most part, not completely, is modeled after the Rambam, meaning the Rambam says things, the 13 principles of faith, that's it. And we don't always recognize that some of what the Rambam himself said was subject to controversy and was not always part of the received tradition. So the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva does talk about free will as an axiom of Judaism, a necessary corollary of reward and punishment. How can there be reward if you're programmed to do good? How could there be punishment if you're programmed to do bad? Right? So the Rambam stresses bechira, bechira, bechira. Interestingly enough, and I'll throw this out as a question, he does not enumerate bechira as one of the 13 principles of faith. It's an amazing thing. On one hand, in Hilchos Tshuva, he absolutely says it is a foundation of Judaism, and yet he doesn't count it in his list of 13 principles. Okay, I'll leave that as a question, but that's something to think about. Now, the problem is that free will raises enormous philosophical problems. There are logical problems with the free will, and that is, and the Rambam himself addresses it, but this is where chassidus krias goes off in a different direction, and that is, if God controls everything, and God is omnipotent, and God is omniscient, so number one, God knows what you're going to choose yesterday, and the day before yesterday, and 1,000 years ago, and 1,000,000 years ago, and 1,000,000,000 years ago. So by the time today comes, God knows exactly what I'm going to be doing. In what possible way can there be a meaningful choice when all of those choices were foreclosed by God's foreknowledge? That's one aspect of the question. Another aspect of the question is, if God controls everything, this is the omnipotence, then how can I do something in violation of the will of God through the exercise of free will? So these are philosophical questions. The Rambam answers them. I don't think we have time to go over what the Rambam's answers are, but there were philosophers who concluded that because of this, it's impossible that human beings have free will, because that would be a contradiction to God's foreknowledge, and it would also be a contradiction to God's omnipotence, in which he controls everything in the universe. Now, the question then becomes, and by the way, this was also a position in Islamic philosophy. In fact, a lot of why the Rambam was addressing free will is in response to a certain branch of Islamic philosophy. And this was also, this also had a resonance in some Christian theology. John Calvin. Calvinists believe in what is called predestination, right? So that resonated within certain parts of Christianity as well. The problem is that the Rambam's logical counterargument is a very compelling argument. What is the justice? What is the fairness of God punishing me if everything was predetermined? What is the entitlement of reward? I mean, that's a very powerful point. What is the purpose of trying to motivate me to do tshuva if no matter what happens, it's all been predetermined? So in a sense, you're going to have logical problems on both sides of the equation. So different philosophers came out a different way. So the question you asked me is, okay, what was the original idea of Judaism? It's hard to know, but it seems more likely that the Torah does emphasize choice. Consider, for example, the famous pasuk, where Hashem says, "Behold, I have placed before you the path of life, the path of death." And the very word the Torah uses is, "Ubacharta b'chayim." You shall choose life. So it seems, again, I mean, I don't want to be machriya in all of this, But it would seem that the more authentic Jewish approach does posit the notion of free will. So I think the Rambam is very correct in this particular question, but indeed it does raise questions. Now the other thing to keep in mind, and again, we just don't have time, I have to stop soon, is the Rav Dessler's extremely valuable insight that everybody has bechira, but the bechira does not always exist on the same plane. See, when the Rambam describes bechira, the Rambam seems to say, at any moment in time, you can decide to be a Rasha, or you can decide to be a tzaddik. Well, is that true? I mean, consider the person who was raised, in the slum, didn't have a father, whatever it would be, was surrounded by bad friends and negative influences. Does God go to that person and say, why aren't you, assuming he's Jewish, why aren't you in Kolel? Why aren't you a great, great tzaddik? You could have made the choice now. Rav Dessler says, obviously, we are victims to some degree of our upbringing, of our past experiences. And God does not expect us, when we're in a certain place, to make the choices that we could have made in a different place. But Rav Dessler's point is, there will always be a fulcrum of choice that you could make. So if you're a drug addict, God does not expect you to choose to kick the habit, but he might expect you to at least start a drug rehabilitation program. This is called the idea of nekudat habechira. Everybody has free will, but the point on the spectrum where they exercise their free will will change from person to person. It's not the binary thing that, hey, you could have been a tzaddik, but you could have done something that would put you closer on the right path. And as we progress through life, the fulcrum point is going to change, right? For every one of us, even today, there are certain things which we're not ready for yet. We're not on the madrega where we can make that choice. And there are other things that, Baruch Hashem, are so behind us. Like most of us don't have to make a conscious choice not to murder. For some people, that may be their avoda. Their avoda might be, don't kill somebody today. But for us, that's not our struggle. Hopefully, it's not our struggle. So you see, some things are behind me already, and some things are ahead of me. And neither of them are my bechira issues. But there's a point in the middle where I could go either way on it. That's my fulcrum point. That's my tipping point. And that is where God judges me, my nekudat habechira. That's an enormously helpful concept, because that does take into account both the idea of human free will and the idea that circumstances may foreclose certain choices. Both ideas are true at the same time, you see? Okay, one last question. Yeah.
This is more of an abstract question.
Okay.
So you don't have an answer, it's fine. But why would God create a world where so many people just don't acknowledge his existence, have no relationship with him?
Yeah. Why did God create a world? Why would he create a world where so many people do not acknowledge him and do not have a relationship with him? So once again, in a sense, all of this is the consequence of choice. In other words, God needed a world where people make choices. If God would create a world of pure virtue, it wouldn't be virtue. We would just be automatons. We would be machines. We would be robots. Robots doing their job might be nice, but I wouldn't call that goodness. Goodness is choice. Now, choice has to mean that the deck is stacked in both directions. So there has to be concealment of God. There has to be the capacity to rebel against God. There has to be the capacity of rejecting God in order that those who choose are making a virtuous choice. So in a sense, evil and kafira and heresy are all necessary to facilitate the exercise of free will. So from a systems engineering point, you need the negatives in order for the positives to be positives. One more, yeah.
What's the halacha behind double head covering for davening, and then also a double part real quick? Why do we raise the pinky during the hagbah?
Yeah. So the double head covering, some shitas say, you should have a double head covering. So that could either be hat, yarmulke, or some even say a yarmulke is a double covering because there's a lining, at least if it's not a kippas ruga, a yarmulke. Or if you're married, you have a yarmulke and you have a talis. It is not in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch requires that your head be covered when you say a bracha, but it does not require that there be a double head covering. But the Zohar does talk about a double covering, and that's basically connected to two aspects of the Shekhinah that's within me and the Shekhinah that's surrounding me, and I acknowledge both of those aspects of godliness. But as I say, it's not. I would not call it a chiyuv, mi'ikar adin. The second one was the pinky. Yeah, so that's a very good question. It's very hard to find the source. It is brought down that you point with your finger when you say v'zos HaTorah. This is the law of the Torah, because zos always means you're pointing to it. But why would it be the pinky? People are still a little perplexed over this. I do remember that the idea of the pinky is brought down in the Me'am Loes. I could find the source, and I even have a whole article that somebody wrote about this. Some connect it to reasons that are kind of crazy. They connect it to the idea that in the European shoals, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, they used to take snuff on Shabbos, and they would sneeze. It was like a luxury. I offered you snuff from a snuff box because you couldn't smoke, and therefore your other fingers were dirty with snuff. The only finger that was clean was the pinky, so you only honored the Torah with your clean finger. Others want to say that the pinky is the smallest finger, and therefore it represents humility, modesty, and we connect to the Torah when we are humble and not when we are arrogant. But as I say, there are different minhagim, and some people do point with their index finger. Not everybody does the pinky itself. Yeah, one more. Yeah, last one. Yeah.
I was wondering, when sending gifts to another Jew, specifically if it's a food gift, if you're sending it to someone who's not an observant Jew, obviously you're sending a kosher item, but do you have to worry about the fact that they're not going to make a bracha on the food?
Yep, this is an excellent question. The Shulchan Aruch says beferish that you are not allowed to give food to a Jewish person who will not make a bracha. And the reason is, since you're not allowed to eat without a bracha, you are causing the Jewish person to do an aveira, and that's forbidden for you under the pasuk, lifnei iver, in front of a blind person, you do not make a stumbling block. So the Shulchan Aruch says, beferish, I cannot give food to a person who will not make a bracha because of lifnei iver. Now, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, I'm going to give you a little bit of an indirect answer. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach had an interesting shaila. Let's imagine your air conditioner, it's 105 degrees, really hot. Your air conditioner broke down, and you have a repairman who comes in who happens not to be religious. Should you offer him water or juice or not? He's not going to make a bracha. So if I simply followed the Shulchan Aruch, I wouldn't offer him water. And even if he asked me for water, I would say, I'm sorry, I can't do it unless you make a bracha. That's if I followed the Shulchan Aruch. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, in such a case, you must offer him water. And the reason is the following. The issur of lifnei iver is you're not allowed to cause another person to sin. But if by causing him to sin, I'll prevent a bigger sin, it's better to cause him to do the smaller sin than to do the bigger sin. What do I mean by that? This is how he explains it. If I don't give the guy water and it's 105 degrees, what is he going to think about religious Jews? What is he going to think about Torah? What is he going to think about Charedim? Selfish, stingy, inconsiderate. And that's going to be a desecration of God's name, and that may distance him completely from Yiddishkeit. If I give him the water, he's committing the sin of without a bracha, yeah. But at least he'll have positive thoughts about religious Jews. And therefore, Rav Shlomo Zalman said, it is better to be machshalim with the small aveira. I mean, the analogy would be, we could take it by, don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind man. Let's imagine a blind man is walking towards a pit that's 50 feet deep. And I steer him to the left where he trips on a log. So I quite literally caused him to trip. But I caused him to trip so he shouldn't fall into a pit that's much worse. Rav Shlomo Zalman said that's the same thing. So now, let's analyze how this would apply to gift giving. So the truth of the matter is, I think gift giving is less of a necessity than perhaps giving water to a repairman on 105 day. But if not giving the food gift would cause resentment, cause animosity, would cause the person to have a bad view of religious Jews, then I think this would be nichlal in Rav Shlomo Zalman's psak. Yeah.
I'm just curious if it would also find a similar sense worrying about someone if they've said Birchas HaTorah in the morning.
So that's an interesting question. You know, you're not allowed to learn Torah without Birchas HaTorah. So what's going on? I mean, let's take Or Sameach. You got people who come, JLE, and all sorts of programs. Some of them sometimes don't even wear a yarmulke. They don't even wear a kippah. They certainly didn't daven, I mean, some do, but a number of them didn't daven shachris, didn't put on tefillin, didn't make Birchas HaTorah. So how am I allowed to teach them Birchas HaTorah? I'm sorry, how am I allowed to teach them Torah? I'm causing them to commit the sin of learning without Birchas HaTorah. It's an excellent question. Once again, we kind of go with Rav Shlomo Zalman, and that is, hey, if the choice is they shouldn't learn or learn without Birchas HaTorah, it is better to learn without Birchas HaTorah than the bigger avera of not learning at all. So if you can't get them to say Birchas HaTorah yet, it is better to learn. That's a davar pashat, that we are not going to not teach people who are in the process of tshuva because of Birchas HaTorah. But it's a very good question.
Is the teacher then over on putting a stumbling block?
No, the answer is no, meaning to say, if he is causing the student to stumble in order to prevent a bigger stumbling block, then the teacher is not over in anything. So it's not an avera at that point. Yeah?
Would there be a way that the teacher can have the students in mind and say the bracha?
Yes, that's a very good idea, but he would have to tell the student that, meaning the student would have intention to be yotzei with the Rebbe's bracha, because if the student doesn't know what's going on, the Rebbe cannot just make it for the student. The Rebbe would have to tell the student, you know, we make a blessing before the Torah, I'm making this for you and me, and you should answer amen. That's perfectly fine. And in fact, if you think about it, I believe the Rebbe could do that even if he already made Birchas HaTorah. Because I could, just like I can make Kiddush, I can make Kiddush for you even though I was Yotzei. I could make Birchas HaTorah for you even though I was Yotzei. So I believe that would be a good idea if the Talmud is ready for it. Yeah?
Can I ask a different question?
Yeah, okay, I do have to stop pretty soon, but okay, you're the last one for sure. Yeah.
If someone claims that a certain book is divine,
A certain book is divine, yeah.
and so if I claim that, but if you understand that God is above logic, that means that if I find contradiction in a book that I claim to be divine, basically worthless, because I cannot, like, for example, if someone says the New Testament is divine, let's say,
Yeah.
then it doesn't matter if there are contradictions in there,
Because God is above logic.
Yeah.
Yep. Very interesting question. But I think our answer would be this. Our answer would be that God in his essence is above logic. But when God has made a decision to communicate to man, it must be in a way that is comprehensible and accessible to human intellect. So therefore, once he has put his wisdom in a book, the book is supposed to be internally consistent, because otherwise it does not communicate. I mean, a book is designed to communicate something to me. In order to communicate, it must be coherent and consistent. So I would differentiate between the transcendental essence of God and the concretization of divinity within a book or a narrative. Okay, so I think that would be our response. Okay, thank you. Be well. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.